A basket floats among the reeds of the Nile. A voice speaks from fire that does not consume. One man stands before the greatest empire on earth, demanding freedom. Subscribe if you love Jesus. The narrative begins not with triumph, but with genocide. Pharaoh had issued the decree. Every Hebrew male infant was to be thrown into the Nile. The command was born of fear, not cruelty alone. The Israelites had multiplied during their centuries in Egypt, grown numerous, become a threat in the paranoid calculation of kings who saw enemies everywhere. The river that gave Egypt life would now serve as instrument of death, drowning the future of a people the empire needed as slaves but feared as potential rebels. Into this machinery of murder, one mother placed her 3-month-old son in a waterproofed basket among the papyrus reeds, entrusting him to the same river meant to kill him. The question that echoes through 3 millennia of Jewish, Christian, and Islamic tradition is not whether Moses was great, his greatness is assumed, but how a man raised in privilege, trained in power, could become the reluctant prophet who shattered an empire and gave the world a law that still shapes civilization. The account is found in Exodus, the second book of the Hebrew Bible, written in a form that blends history, theology, and epic narrative. Scholars debate its composition date, its historical accuracy, its relationship to archaeological evidence. Some place the Exodus in the 13th century BCE during the reign of Ramesses II. Others argue for earlier or later dates. Egyptian records, meticulous about many things, make no clear mention of Hebrew slaves or their departure, though absence of evidence is not evidence of absence. What can be said is that the story of Moses became foundational for 3 major world religions, that his encounter with God on a mountain produced ethical monotheism, and that whether every detail occurred exactly as written, the narrative shaped human understanding of justice, law, and divine purpose for over 3,000 years. The baby in the basket was found by Pharaoh's daughter, bathing in the Nile with her attendants. She recognized the child as Hebrew, but chose mercy over obedience to her father's decree. The infant's sister, Miriam, watching from a distance, offered to find a Hebrew wet nurse, the child's own mother, returned to him through providence or coincidence that the text presents as divine intervention. Moses, a name possibly derived from Egyptian meaning son or from Hebrew meaning drawn out, grew up in the royal household, educated in Egyptian wisdom, trained in administration and warfare, positioned to inherit privilege few could imagine. But identity divided him. He was Hebrew by birth, Egyptian by upbringing, belonging fully to neither. The text records that when Moses was grown, he went out to his people and saw their forced labor. He witnessed an Egyptian beating a Hebrew. Looking this way and that, seeing no one, he killed the Egyptian and hid the body in the sand. The murder, there is no gentler word, was impulsive, passionate, an act that revealed both his identification with the oppressed and his failure to control the violence within himself. Intention may have been just, but method was murder. The next day, Moses tried to intervene in a dispute between 2 Hebrews. One challenged him, "Who made you a ruler and judge over us? Are you thinking of killing me as you killed the Egyptian?" The secret was known. Pharaoh sought to kill him. Moses fled across the desert to Midian, a region east of Egypt, becoming a refugee, abandoning privilege for survival. He found a well where shepherds watered their flocks. When local shepherds drove away, the daughters of Jethro, priest of Midian, Moses defended them. Jethro offered hospitality, then a daughter in marriage. Moses settled into obscurity, tending sheep in the wilderness. A prince become shepherd, a murderer become family man, his people still enslaved, his past buried in sand and distance. 40 years passed. The number is likely symbolic. Biblical Hebrew uses 40 to mean a generation, a complete period, but whether literal or figurative, the meaning is clear. Moses spent decades in exile. His early passion cooled to resignation. His identity as deliverer replaced by the modest calling of keeping his father-in-law's flocks. Then came the mountain, Horeb, also called Sinai, rising from the wilderness, a place already considered sacred. Moses led the sheep to the mountain's far side and saw something impossible. A bush, burning but not consumed, flame without fuel, fire that destroyed nothing. He turned aside to investigate. Then the voice spoke from the fire, identifying itself as the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Moses hid his face, afraid to look at God. The voice announced divine awareness of Israel's suffering, divine intention to deliver them from Egypt and bring them to a land flowing with milk and honey. Then came the commission that would define Moses' life. "I am sending you to Pharaoh to bring my people, the Israelites, out of Egypt." Moses responded not with eagerness, but with objections that reveal a man acutely aware of his limitations. "Who am I that I should go to Pharaoh?" he asked, questioning his adequacy. God promised presence. "I will be with you." Moses asked for God's name, seeking credentials to present to the Israelites. The answer came in Hebrew as 4 consonants, YHWH, sometimes vocalized as Yahweh, translated as "I am who I am," or "I will be what I will be," a name that claims absolute existence, self-definition, and sovereign freedom. This was not another tribal deity, but the God who created all things, who needed no explanation and brooked no rivals. Moses objected again. The people would not believe him. God gave him signs: a staff that became a serpent, a hand that became leprous and was healed, water from the Nile that would turn to blood. Moses objected a 3rd time. "I am slow of speech and tongue." Whether he had a speech impediment or simply lacked eloquence, the objection was real. God offered Aaron, Moses' brother, as spokesman. Still, Moses resisted. "Please send someone else." The text notes that God's anger burned against Moses, but the commission stood. The reluctant prophet had run out of excuses. Moses returned to Egypt at age 80, according to the text, accompanied by Aaron and armed with divine promises and miraculous signs. They gathered the elders of Israel, performed the signs, announced God's intention to deliver them. The people believed and worshipped. Then Moses and Aaron went to Pharaoh with the demand that would echo through history: "Let my people go." Pharaoh's response was predictable. "Who is the Lord that I should obey his voice and let Israel go? I do not know the Lord, and I will not let Israel go." The refusal was not merely political, but theological. Egypt had gods aplenty, a pantheon that legitimized royal power and explained natural phenomena. This unknown Hebrew deity had no standing in Egyptian theology, no power Pharaoh recognized, no claim he needed to acknowledge. The confrontation was not merely between Moses and Pharaoh, but between YHWH and the gods of Egypt, between a people enslaved and an empire that depended on their labor. Pharaoh increased the Israelites' burdens, requiring them to gather their own straw while maintaining the same quota of bricks. The people turned on Moses and Aaron, blaming them for making their situation worse. Moses cried out to God in frustration, "Why have you brought trouble on this people? Is this why you sent me?" The reluctant prophet was learning that deliverance rarely comes cleanly, that liberation has costs, that God's timetable does not match human impatience. Then began the plagues, 10 catastrophes that struck Egypt in escalating severity. Water turned to blood, making the Nile undrinkable. Frogs swarmed from the river, invading houses, ovens, kneading troughs. Gnats covered humans and animals. Flies filled Egyptian homes, but not Hebrew dwellings. Livestock died in the fields. Boils afflicted people and animals. Hail destroyed crops and killed those caught outside. Locusts devoured what the hail had spared. Darkness covered Egypt for 3 days, so thick it could be felt. Each plague targeted aspects of Egyptian life and religion. The Nile, worshipped as a god, became blood. Frogs, associated with the goddess Heket, became plague. The sun god Ra was eclipsed by darkness. The sequence demonstrated that Egypt's gods could not protect what they supposedly controlled, that YHWH had power over nature itself, that Pharaoh's claims to divinity were hollow. Contemporary scholarship notes that some plagues could have natural explanations: algae blooms, insect infestations, volcanic ash, but the text presents them as divine judgments, timed and targeted to prove a point. The God of the enslaved Hebrews was sovereign over the most powerful empire on earth. After each plague, Pharaoh hardened his heart, or, in some passages, God hardened Pharaoh's heart, a theological problem that has troubled interpreters for millennia. Did Pharaoh choose obstinacy, or was he predestined to refuse? The text supports both readings, suggesting a complex interaction between human will and divine purpose, freedom and sovereignty, choice and consequence. What is clear is that Pharaoh repeatedly promised to release Israel, then reneged when the immediate pressure lifted, until finally the cost became unbearable. The 10th plague was death itself. God announced through Moses that at midnight, every firstborn in Egypt would die. From Pharaoh's household to the lowest servant, including livestock, the Israelites were commanded to sacrifice lambs, mark their doorposts with blood, and remain inside. The Lord would pass over houses marked with blood. but death would strike every unmarked home. This was Passover, the feast that would become central to Jewish identity, commemorating the night when death passed over Israel and struck Egypt, when the final barrier to freedom was removed through the sacrifice of lambs and the protective power of blood. At midnight, the text records, "A great cry arose in Egypt, for there was not a house without someone dead." Pharaoh summoned Moses and Aaron in the night and commanded them to leave immediately, taking flocks and herds, asking for blessing even as he expelled them. The Egyptians urged the Hebrews to hurry, fearing they would all die. The exodus began in haste, unleavened bread carried in kneading troughs because there was no time for dough to rise. 600,000 men on foot, plus women and children, and a mixed multitude of non-Israelites, left Egypt after 430 years. According to the text's reckoning, the journey toward freedom led to the Red Sea, or perhaps the Sea of Reeds, the Hebrew Yam Suf ambiguous in location. Behind them, Pharaoh changed his mind, regretting the loss of slave labor, and pursued with his army. The Israelites found themselves trapped between water and chariots, crying out in terror. Moses told them to stand firm and see the deliverance of the Lord. Then God commanded Moses to stretch out his staff over the sea. All night, a strong east wind drove back the waters, creating dry ground. The Israelites crossed on dry land with walls of water on both sides. The Egyptian army pursued into the seabed. At dawn, God threw the Egyptian forces into confusion. Chariot wheels came off, panic spread. Moses stretched out his hand again, and the waters returned, drowning the Egyptian army. Not one survived. The text records that Israel saw the great power the Lord displayed against Egypt, and the people feared the Lord and trusted Moses, his servant. The greatest military power of the age was destroyed in pursuing those who were once powerless. The gods of Egypt could not save their own. 3 months later, the Israelites arrived at Mount Sinai. There God invited Moses up the mountain, and there the law was given, the 10 Commandments, spoken by God's voice. Hundreds of additional laws delivered through Moses, the blueprint for a society organized around ethical monotheism rather than royal decree. The law addressed worship, justice, social relations, dietary practices, ritual purity, criminal punishment, property rights, care for the vulnerable. It was comprehensive, touching every aspect of life, transforming former slaves into a covenant people bound by law rather than mere kinship. While Moses was on the mountain 40 days, receiving the law, the people below grew restless. They demanded that Aaron make them gods to worship, gods they could see. Aaron collected gold jewelry and fashioned a golden calf, perhaps echoing Egyptian bull worship, certainly violating the commandment against idols. The people declared the calf to be the god who brought them out of Egypt. They offered sacrifices and held a festival that descended into revelry. God told Moses what was happening and announced intention to destroy the people and start over with Moses. Moses interceded, arguing that Egypt would mock if God brought Israel out, only to destroy them in the wilderness, appealing to God's promises to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. God relented. Moses descended with the stone tablets bearing the commandments. When he saw the calf and the dancing, his anger burned. He threw down the tablets, breaking them at the mountain's foot. He burned the calf, ground it to powder, scattered it on water, and made the Israelites drink it. He called for those loyal to the Lord. The sons of Levi responded. Moses commanded them to kill those who led the rebellion. 3,000 died that day. Moses returned up the mountain, interceding again, offering to have his name blotted from God's book if the people could not be forgiven. God refused the substitution but promised to continue leading Israel while punishing those who sinned. Moses carved new tablets and spent another 40 days on the mountain. When he descended, his face shone with reflected divine glory, so brightly that he had to veil himself when speaking to the people. The pattern established at Sinai repeated through 40 years in the wilderness. The people complained, Moses interceded, God provided and judged, the community moved toward the promised land by stages, rebellions and miracles alternating in what became a grinding test of endurance. They complained about food. God provided manna and quail. They complained about water. Moses struck a rock and water flowed. They spoke against Moses and God. Venomous serpents struck them until Moses lifted a bronze serpent on a pole, and those who looked at it lived. They reached the border of Canaan and sent spies to explore the land. The spies reported that the land was good, but the inhabitants were powerful, the cities fortified. 10 spies counseled against entering. Only Joshua and Caleb argued for trusting God and proceeding. The people sided with the majority, panicked, and proposed returning to Egypt. God announced judgment. The entire generation that left Egypt, except Joshua and Caleb, would die in the wilderness. They would wander 40 years until all adults who left Egypt had died. Their children would enter the land they refused. Moses himself was included in this judgment, though his exclusion came later. At Meribah, when the people again complained about water, God told Moses to speak to a rock. Instead, Moses struck the rock twice with his staff, perhaps in anger, perhaps in doubt. Water flowed, but God told Moses and Aaron they would not enter the promised land because they failed to honor God as holy before the people. The punishment seems harsh for a moment's failure after decades of faithful service, but the text presents it as consequence for public misrepresentation of God's character at a crucial moment. Aaron died on Mount Hor, his priesthood passing to his son Eleazar. Moses continued leading the people through battles with Canaanite kings, through Balak's attempt to curse Israel, through the prophet Balaam, through another plague and another rebellion. He took a census of the new generation and appointed Joshua as his successor. He delivered extended speeches recorded in Deuteronomy, recounting the law, reciting Israel's history, warning against idolatry, commanding loyalty to the covenant, promising blessings for obedience and curses for disobedience. At age 120, his eyes undimmed and his vigor unabated according to the text, Moses climbed Mount Nebo to view the promised land from a distance. God showed him the land Gilead to Dan, all of Naphtali, Ephraim, and Manasseh, all of Judah to the Mediterranean Sea, the Negev, the plain of the valley of Jericho as far as Zoar. This is the land I promised on oath to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, God said. I have let you see it with your eyes, but you will not cross over into it. Moses died there in Moab and was buried in a valley, but no one knows where to this day. The text records that he was 120 years old, that Israel mourned him 30 days, and that no prophet has arisen in Israel like Moses, whom the Lord knew face to face. The assessment is both praise and elegy, recognition that Moses stood unique in Israel's history as the lawgiver, the liberator, the mediator between God and people, the reluctant prophet who became the most consequential figure in Jewish history. His legacy extends far beyond Judaism. Christianity sees Moses as prefiguring Christ, the Exodus, anticipating salvation, the Passover lamb foreshadowing Jesus' sacrifice, the law preparing the way for grace. Islam honors Moses as one of the greatest prophets, mentioned more often in the Quran than any figure except Muhammad. The Ten Commandments influence Western legal systems. The Exodus story inspired liberation movements from the Puritan migration to America to the civil rights movement to anti-apartheid struggles in South Africa. Let my people go became a cry for freedom across centuries and continents. Scholars continue debating the historicity of the Exodus and Moses himself. No Egyptian records clearly document the events described. Archaeological evidence for Israelite presence in Canaan appears gradually rather than through sudden invasion. Some argue the Exodus is mythological, a founding narrative created to unify disparate tribes into a nation with shared identity. Others point to elements that suggest historical memory, the Egyptian names, the details of Egyptian life, the route descriptions, the preservation of seemingly embarrassing details like Moses' speech impediment and exclusion from Canaan. Whether every detail occurred as written, the narrative's power is undeniable. It introduces ethical monotheism, the idea that one God created all things and demands justice, mercy, and faithfulness rather than mere ritual. It establishes law as covenant, mutual obligation between God and people, protection for the vulnerable encoded in divine command. It presents liberation as divine action, freedom as gift and responsibility, chosenness as burden, not privilege. Moses himself remains complex, fully human despite his unique role. He murdered in anger, fled in fear, resisted God's call, lost his temper, doubted at crucial moments, never saw the fulfillment of the promise that drove him. Yet he also interceded for the people who constantly rebelled against him, spent decades in faithful service despite ingratitude, gave Israel the law that shaped Western civilization, and spoke with God face to face. He was reluctant, flawed, doubting, yet he stood before Pharaoh and demanded freedom, led millions through wilderness, and died looking at a land he would never enter, trusting that God's promise would be kept even if he did not live to see it. The basket that floated among reeds carried more than an infant escaping genocide. It carried the future of a people, the seed of a faith that would outlast empires, the beginning of a story that would shape human understanding of God, justice, and freedom for 3 millennia. The reluctant prince who became a shepherd, who became a prophet, demonstrates that God's calling does not depend on eagerness or qualification, but on willingness to say yes when the fire burns and the voice speaks, to stand before power and demand justice, to lead even when the destination is unseen and the path uncertain. Moses died on a mountain, looking at promise unfulfilled, buried in an unknown grave, mourned by a people he liberated but could not enter rest with. Yet his words endure. His law continues, his example inspires, and his testimony to a God who hears the cry of the oppressed and acts in history to bring freedom echoes still wherever slaves dream of liberation and prophets dare to confront the powers that enslave them.